Um, my mother was an unusual person. She was enough older than me that she should have been my grandmother. And maybe that's why she wasn't so stressed with the irritating things I did as a teenager. But the worst one of all was to go by my name as Bea instead of Beatrice, because there was going to be no nicknames in that family. And just think, if teenagers today, that was the worst thing they could think of doing, wouldn't that be heaven? Okay, so when the doctor told me she had 6 months to live, I had moved her to my house. And I didn't realize it was going to be 2 months. And there were 9 children in her family. And of course she accounts to 1, so there's 8 more. Well, there's 7 of them were still alive, and I invited them all to come to my house and visit with my mother. And 3 of them actually came several times. And they were my aunt, well, my Aunt Ruth, my Aunt Alta, and my Uncle Roland. And my mother was born a twin in Everett in 1907. And the doctor said, nah, you're not going to make it. We're not going to do birth certificates and all that. And my grandfather took time off of working. And he put the 2 little baby girls in the top drawer of his wife's dresser in shoe boxes with warm hot water type bags underneath. And it says in the book, as one of the, they were both weighed at the fish market 6 weeks later with clean diapers on. They were put on the scale at the fish market, and that's a good example of how things have changed nowadays. So, on the cover of the book, I don't even know if it's going to work when I push the button. I think it is. I have a picture of my grandmother. It's my grandmother. And there are 2 little babies. The one on the right is blonde. That's my mother's twin. The one on her left, grandma's left, is my mother, the brunette. And this is a picture of them when they're about 3 years old. Now I'm going to go back. See my grandmother's dress, that plaid material? Her mother sewed that for her. And see this same plaid material on the dresses, the trim, the little skirts and the sash and the cuffs are the same material as the, my mom said that was a fine, real fine wool. It was a very nice fabric. And my mother had a remarkable memory, obviously. This is my grandfather. The book, obviously my mother didn't write the book. And I talk as if Eunice talking in the book. So Eunice now, so this would be Eunice's dad, but it's my grandfather. And he was a veteran of the Spanish-American War. And after the war, he went back to the home that he used to have in Minnesota on Big Lake. And he didn't have the job that he was logging before the war. He and his best friend worked on a group of farmers that went around when they needed extra help on the farms. And that's what he was doing. And he just happened to accidentally notice that the teacher at the Big Lake one-room elementary school was a nice-looking young lady, and she wasn't married. So his friend went on to be the bookkeeper of the Nickerson Company, the Clow Nickerson Company, that's 2 names. And when Mr. David Clow ran for the governor of Minnesota, he went along with him to the house, it's to be the White House of Minnesota, and served as his personal secretary. And he married the governor's daughter. So all the trees around Minnesota were all cut down, already cut up for lumber. And the people who did that, like my great-grandfather, he logged, he took all the stumps off, and he built a big dairy. And his whole market was Minneapolis, because they were right by Minneapolis. And my great-grandfather married his first cousin. Oh, shock. She came from a long line of whaling captains that had accumulated quite a bit of money. And when I started doing my genealogy, I started in 1976. It was my bicentennial project. I knew they'd made all their money whaling, at sea. I didn't know what they did. And I was just afraid I was going to find out that they were slavers. And I was so relieved when I found out it was only whales, that were. But his wife was in line, and she inherited all the money. And so in the book it says it was either for love or money, I'm not sure, but he married his first cousin, and then he was in charge of all the money. And he actually built the Minnesota-Mexican Railroad, was the president and vice president of that. And then, so he knew Jim Hill, and Jim Hill said, "Oh, you have to come look at Everett. Everett has trees." So they came and they looked, and my mother's uncle, grand uncle, owned the Nickerson Mill in Everett. And there's a lot of things in my book that I don't think the people of Everett that are historians even know about. But they're things that these people talked about their childhoods in my living room for several weeks, maybe 10 weeks. On Tuesday mornings, they talked about their childhood, and they didn't say everything in the right order, like, gee, we had a lot of snow on Pine Street, but when they robbed the bank in Lake Stevens. And so my job was to string all these things together in the right logical order that they happened. And I think Mr. Sievers, he's a little guy peeking out of the corner of the picture. I think he must have been a veteran of the Spanish-American War, because those men all hung together really well. And he just loved my grandfather as one of his employees. And this particular truck is loaded with coal, and it is the first truck to arrive in Snohomish County. It came from Seattle to Everett on a barge. The man who brought it taught my grandfather to drive in one day. There was no driver's licenses or no license plates on the cars because there weren't any. And then he went back to Seattle that evening. And so my grandfather was then a professional truck driver. And the next year, the truck did so well, the boss ordered a second truck. And he ended up owning a new truck every year. And when I taught school in 1967 in Mukilteo, the H.O. Seifert Company was still in business in Everett. And I'll talk more about that company later. So I had to put this picture in because nobody has a picture of this picture. Doesn't make sense. The man who is standing in the back in the dark suit is Alvin Nickerson, is the man who owned the Nickerson lumber mill on the waterfront in Everett. He built it in 1902, and that is my mother's great-grandfather. The fellow sitting in front of him is my mother's great-grandfather. He is Thomas Nickerson, and doesn't he look like a whaler? Right on. He just really does. This is his daughter, and his granddaughter. Is a family portrait. And, Lake Stevens Museum is going to end up with all these pictures, but this picture was in my grandmother's Christmas card in 1910. And is written on the back. He's telling me who the people are and their ages. So this one is like those letters you get, that are in the museum. Right here. This is faded, and I knew it was faded. Looks better up there than here. This is the picture of my grandparents' house. So my grandparents, this great-grandparents, on my grandfather's side, he came from Germany, and I'll talk more about that later. He and his wife owned a farm on Big Lake in Minnesota. They had 12 children. They had 8 daughters and 4 sons. One son died of appendicitis. One son did not want to farm. My grandfather went to fight in the Spanish-American War, and he was 76 years old, and he could not farm himself alone with just one son. And he found out about Everett, and we're not quite sure how, but they moved to Everett. And so when my grandfather married my grandmother, that would make sense. They were a little bit disappointed that he only had an 8th grade education, and they let her know that. And so they decided to move to Everett and join his parents. So that's how they all ended up moving to Everett. And for a while, there were the 2 families I had to write about, my great-grandparents and my grandparents, my mom's house. But then my grandmother's youngest brother and his wife moved to Everett, and all 3 families lived on the same block. So I think I had something like 18 people I could pick from for stories.
Okay.
So it's a good thing mostly they behave themselves, right? Turn, okay. This is my grandfather in a Spanish-American War uniform.
He looks like your kids.
Yeah. He went to sign up with his best friend in the whole world, a man named Roland Hartley. Roland Hartley became the mayor of Everett eventually and the governor of the state of Washington, but he was my grandfather's best friend. And they both went to Texas to train, and my grandfather came down with the measles, so he was in the hospital and quarantined for a whole month. And he got out of quarantine, and then he came down with the mumps, so he was back in the hospital again for a month. And only one group of people hadn't been deployed yet. All the people going to the Philippines were all shipped out. All the Washington State and Minnesota State soldiers went to the Philippines. He was left alone. So there was this one group left to go, and they were going to be cavalry. They're going to ride horses around in Cuba. And Company B were the people that would take care of the horses. So the government decided that that's best where he would fit, would be taking care of horses. So what it meant that he became a Rough Rider, and he went to Cuba with Teddy Roosevelt. And in Cuba, his dad had been in the Prussian army for 19 years, and his dad had commissions and awards for his good marksmanship, and he taught his little boy on the big lake that when he went out to shoot squirrels for dinner, he needed to shoot them through the eye so he wouldn't wreck the meat. He was really a good shot. And online it says a list of the different weapons they had in Cuba. And then it says at the bottom, but of course Teddy Roosevelt's group were different. They had a lot of private money, and they had a lot of different weapons and a lot of different things that the other soldiers didn't have. He had 2 Sharps rifles, which were the kind that shot the buffalo on the plains. They sat on tripods with telescopes. He was the sniper when they were in battle. And Teddy Roosevelt said he'd saved his life many, many, many times over. Teddy Roosevelt was really his good friend for as long as he lived, and a personal friend. And I said this in the book, but you're going to read it and you're going to say, oh, I don't believe that. I absolutely don't believe that. But Teddy Roosevelt knew he had heart trouble. They had these conventions, and often my grandfather was the commander of the post in Everett because he was the only one that was a Rough Rider. So even though he wasn't like really high on the social class order, he was top dog in the Everett group because he had been in Cuba with Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt went to the academy, and he said, well, which cadet is really like the most promising? I want to find one. I want to ask him something. And they pointed out this one particular cadet, and he invited him to the convention to meet his person that he really felt obligated to take care of the rest of his life. And they made the agreement, and Teddy died, and the name of the cadet was Eisenhower. I'm not kidding. So when my grandfather was in Retzel, which is a retirement home over by Bremerton, I wanted to he was 90, I wanted to take my baby boy over and get a group picture, so I have a picture of 4 generations. And I had an oil painting made of the old farm, and we went, my mother and I went, and retired President Eisenhower had been there the day before, and the nurses were moving my grandfather to a room where he'd get more attention. And he was really crappy. Oh, he's mad. He didn't want to move to another room. But that's in the book. And the biggest thing, and there's two stories, and I'm not going to tell you the stories, you got to read them, but there's one story he would tell the women and the girls about Cuba, and a totally different story that he would tell the men. And Roland came to my meetings, my Uncle Roland, so I got the man's story too. So they're both in the book. And yes, I said how I really was my grandpa's friend. Okay. This is the warehouse. It was right by the railroad tracks. It's the H.O. Seifert warehouse. I was wondering about the origin of the H.O. Seifert Company, and I was just playing online with, well, first of all, I had the West Virginia encyclopedia, just an encyclopedia just about West Virginia and coal mines. And then I found out that the youngest Seifert brother was 16 when he immigrated to the United States, and the family was building machinery. So in a little while, I'll show you one of the machines that they built that they had in Everett. But this is the warehouse. I get this right. This is the Nickerson Mill in Everett. And I bought 2 postcards online. This one actually says Clark Nickerson Mill, Lumber Company. I wanted permission to use them in my book, and I got a letter back from one of them that said, "Lady, copyrights run out at 70 years. These postcards are way older than 70 years. You don't need a copyright to use them." Okay, all right. Didn't think about that. This is my mother's paternal grandparents. They're my grandfather's parents. They lived across the street from them. Their house, my grandfather's house, grandmother's house in Everett, was right in the middle of the I-5 freeway today. And they picked up the house and they moved it, and my mother doesn't know where it got moved to. But the house that is still remaining is the second house left on Pine Street. So if you drive by, don't bother the people, but that's the house that the grandparents lived in. This is another picture of them. He is 87 years old in this picture, and she is 59, I think. They were quite a bit different. She has a great story in the book, too. They met on the ship on the way over, fell in love when she had an arranged marriage all made for her with her grandmother and some people in the United States. And, you know, she just couldn't find her cousin in Boston, and she really quickly married my great-grandfather. But there's a good story on that. You'll see it in the book. This is the other set of grandparents. The guns are because they're raising turkeys, and they have to keep the coyotes away. So it meant on Sunday, one of them could go to town to church. The other one had to stay home with the gun ready in case coyotes showed up. And the next Sunday, the other one got to drive the team of horses and the wagon into town for the church, and that one stayed at home. So every January, one or the other came to my grandparents' house in Everett to visit. And the year that I'm writing about the book, it was his turn to come, so he was there. But when she came every other year, she sewed dresses for everybody, and clothing for everybody. This is the coal loading machine from the H.O. Seifert Company, the company that they got a franchise. They bought a franchise for it in Everett. The railroad tracks are off to the back of the truck, and the coal is lifted by like a conveyor belt or something. It's mechanical. And I'm going to go over there in a minute. I'm going to point out the people that are actually in this picture. My grandfather's sitting in the driver's seat, and that is one of his trucks, and he's going to be delivering that coal. I forget I use a cane. There we go. There's a man right here who's running the machine electronically. And then, of course, there's the man that's climbing out of the truck or into the truck for some reason. And then my grandfather is at the driver's seat. And I didn't know that before. I learned so much about these people when I wrote this book. They had 12 children, okay, 8 daughters. This is the youngest daughter. Her name is Molly. And this is her christening day. On my grandfather's side, they were Catholic. My grandmother's side was Protestant. There was a big to-do when the two little girls, the twins, were going to go to first grade. Were they going to go to the German Catholic church in town and learn to read and write in German? Or were they going to go to the private schools, public schools in town and learn to read and write in English? And my grandmother won, and they went to the English-speaking school. And I was just thinking of the handicap that it would have been for my mother if she'd learned to read and write in German. Now, she never said she could speak German, but she encouraged me to take German in high school. And when I was trying to memorize the words and stuff, a lot of it came back to her. So her grandparents only spoke German. So these children could understand it pretty much. But they would speak English to their grandparents, and their grandparents understand them perfectly speak when they did that. It was kind of interesting. Okay. This is Uncle Richard. It is my grandmother's youngest brother. He is in his World War I uniform. And when you read the book, you'll find out why he decided to enlist in the Army. He's the one that became the second truck driver for the Seifert Company. So when he enlisted, he knew they would need truck drivers in Europe, and that's what he did. He drove a truck with supplies all the way through World War I. This is the first truck. It is decorated for the Memorial Parade in Everett. They did not have 4th of July parades. They had a parade every Memorial Day. And the driver is my grandfather. The man standing up, facing you with the hat on, right behind my mother, that's Uncle Richard. The girl in the white dress standing up is my mother, Una. You can barely see the blonde head of her twin behind her. And then the little girl sitting is Ruth. And Ina was the only one of the 9 who graduated from college. She went back to college when her oldest son went to college, to the University of Washington, and she became a home ec teacher. And she had cancer and passed in 1976. So when I'm talking about Ina and Una, it's kind of like Ina gave me permission to speak for her, but she wasn't one of the people who helped dictate the book. She could have told some good stories about my mother, and meanwhile, my mother told some good stories about Ina, so I have those stories. This is a picture of the children before they moved to the farm. There was a baby named Rose, and Rose isn't in the picture, and so the baby in the middle is the first boy. They had 4 daughters, and then they had a boy. And then they had 3 or 4 more daughters. I mean, lots of girls. They had 6 girls, and the 2 boys, the other 2 boys were the last 2 children born. And some of you know Fred. We called him Junior, because that's what everybody called him. He was born 20 years after my mother was. He was born right after my mother and Ina, a year after they both graduated from high school. This is the barn. It stood for a long time. The house is still lived in. They built a new barn, and the new barn fell down and is long gone, and the old barn is still sitting there. But this is the barn that was there quite early, because there's a little shed in front of the barn, and if you use a magnifying glass, there's 2 horses in that shed harnessed to a wagon. And those horses, you can see Dolly. Dolly's the white horse. She's a brown horse. It's Dolly's colt. It's harnessed beside her. Okay, I just hit the wrong one, but everything worked okay, so. The barn, okay. This is the 1-room elementary school that they went to. It's got 2 rooms. They built the second room the second year they were there. Now in Everett, you ever seen those little schools with all those windows along the side? They didn't have any electricity in that schoolroom. All the light came in those windows. There was no electricity in the whole school, although they did have flush toilets. And on a cold, rainy winter day, the room was so dark you could hardly see to write inside. And Ina was short and nearsighted, so she sat in the front of the room, and my mother was tall and farsighted, and she sat in the back, but they always dressed, always, all the way through high school, dressed exactly alike. If you didn't know the family, though, you'd think that Ruth, the next child, and Ina were twins because they were about the same height. So this is the Sunday school in Lake Stevens. And my mother is, let's see, well, she's standing when I look at her to the left, but she'd be the right if the teacher turned on the teacher. And the girl right beside her is Yuda, my mother. Ina is the blonde in the front row on the very end, and Ruth is beside there. And I don't know if it's good enough that you can see that the two twins are wearing the same dress. Anyway, I thought it was interesting that there's only one boy in the picture, and he's standing right beside the teacher. I have an idea that he was the teacher's son, but all these girls would be in this Sunday school class, and one boy, they had to walk 3 miles to get to that Sunday school class. Hartford was closer, but in Hartford, the church was a Swedish Baptist church, and it was conducted in Swedish. And Swedish and German read pretty much alike, but they don't talk, alike at all. So they went to the one in Lake Stevens. This is a ticket to ride the Galloping Goose to Monte Cristo. On the back of the ticket, this was actually my mother's scrapbook, and before I'd write the last thing in the book, about the last thing I did was I took the ticket off of the book and turned it over. And I did put that in the book, what it says. And you buy the ticket in Seattle, and it doesn't say how much it was, and you have to get on this 9:30 a.m. interurban to Everett. Then you have to get on the Jitney bus to Hartford, get on the first train that goes to Monte Cristo, and you can get to Monte Cristo by 2:30 in the afternoon. And it lists all the little establishments, all the little settlements, like Robe. I think there's the Robe Bridge. I didn't know that people lived there, that it was, a settlement, but it was. And it doesn't say Big Four. It says Camp Glacier. That's what they call Big Four. But they made stops at all those places. Now, if no one had a ticket to go beyond Granite Falls, they didn't go beyond Granite Falls. You had to pay the money. Somebody had to be paying, and then they would go all the way to the end of the tracks. My mom got to ride it one time. They went from Hartford to Granite Falls, and it was really bumpy. She said not quite like a roller coaster, but it was a lot of fun, but her parents didn't appreciate all those bumps at all. So, kids thought they were great. This is from the cliff that is east of the house, the farmhouse. And Fred Cushman Jr. took the picture. He's standing up on top of the cliff, and they owned the land to the top of the cliff, looking down at the farm. And then you have the road and the trees on the other side, and I talk a lot about the trace. It was an old-fashioned road that was just a trail, but you could drive a wagon on it. And it actually took off a little bit to the right side of the house, so I don't have a picture of the trace, but we do a lot of talking about the trace. The trace went like straight up the hill almost. And the pig pen, which is real important when I start talking about the bank robbery, is to just down the other side of the trace. It was like 10-acre pig pen on the hillside. Oh, the new barn. The barn is over on the left-hand side. And then there's another building with an aluminum roof that's light colored. That's the new barn. And the old barn is going to outlast the new barn. That's so much for the way barns were constructed, right? Okay, this is my grandfather. Eventually, he had to go back to work. They just were not making enough money to make the mortgage payments. They traded their house in town, their nice brand new house, for the farm as a down payment. And then they had to make a $100 payment each month. And I don't know how much $100 is in American money like nowadays, but I know that he worked for 33 cents an hour where he worked. So you can calculate that if you want to do the math. He's standing in front of his rowboat that he owns because when the Snohomish River floods and he wants to go to work, he has to row the boat across the floodwater to get to Everett to go to work and then back again. And usually the boats were tipped upside down with the names of the person written on the back, and you'd go at the bottom of Cavalier's Hill. There were all those rowboats with people's names painted on the bottoms of them. There was a better picture on the flood that Snow Isle had, and it was actually owned by the Everett Herald. And Snow Isle kept putting me off, and I did not get permission to use it. This is from your museum. It's a picture of the Snohomish River at mid-flood. You can see in the distance the telephone poles or the electric light poles. That's where Everett is. And then if you look, I don't know in the middle if that's a car that got marooned out there or what that is, but the telephone poles run on the road all the way across the water, so you can see where the road is. And this is another picture from your museum. Your museum people, Cindy was so helpful to me. Just love her. I think they're coming off of the bridge from Everett across the Snohomish River, and it is flooding. I think the three people on the corner waiting for it, I think it's the bus coming, Tim Lizzie, to pick them up. But I cannot explain what is behind. Looks like a whole bunch of people standing behind. I don't understand what that is. I will probably never know. That is in the book, though. It's a good picture. This is the picture of the river, the swimming hole. So this German people, well, they're half Germans, they've changed their name to the same name. The sound's the same, but it's now an English name. It's spelled in English. They're moving from Everett to an all-Scandinavian community right when World War I is starting, right when America is going into the war. And they were really suspicious. They didn't know who they were or what they were, but they certainly weren't Scandinavians. Now, the kids at school were very polite. They were very, very nice. But they weren't, when they weren't at school, like they would go into Hartford and everybody was speaking Swedish, or the few Norwegians probably, but mostly it was Swedish. And, so nobody could understand anything. And about the second year, somebody said, well, I'm going to go back to that old swimming hole. I don't care who lives there. And somebody came down the trail and found this very happy family to see them. And some of the kids probably went down and swam with them. And pretty soon more people came, and then, then the children started bringing their parents. And the best swimming hole on the river was back in business. And it was like, oh, did we ever meet you? Yeah, like several times when you spoke Swedish. No, they didn't say that. They were just so happy to be, accepted in the community, even though it was a tough year and a half to start with when no one was really talking to them. This is Ina in the bathing suit, the first one on the log. And the next person is Bill, her brother. And I think the lady, the little girl behind, is Bill's girlfriend. Her name is Viola, and he married twice, and they were both named Viola. So I don't know about anybody else, but I call him Viola number 1 and Viola number 2, and I don't really know either one's maiden names. But she's in, I have one more picture of the swimming hole, and she's the only one I can find in it that I know. And, okay. This is the house, the farmhouse. It's the only picture I have of it. I put it in, and I know it's not a good picture, but you could tell the delicate, designs on the posts for the porch, and, the great architectural beauty of the thing. Like, no. It's pretty plain and pretty solid and pretty just the bare bottoms of what you needed. The 6 girls are sitting there on the porch. Well, 5 of them are. Ruth is not in the picture. And the little boy in front is Roland. And he's the man that came that provided me with the man's side of the story, on the Cuba trip. This is my grandmother. She has had 8 children by this time, and she's only 37 years old. And she's standing there. This is the swimming hole with 16 neighbors in it. I think that's a great picture. I didn't even know I had that picture, but I did. And the girl that's on your far right is the one that I think is Viola. and it's the only one I have a big magnifying glass. It's the only one I can recognize. So it's not a family reunion. It's older. This is a different day and a different parade. So what they did on Memorial Day, they would pick every single flower that was blooming in their house, and I don't know, around the house. If they put them in water, I don't know what they did. They didn't say that. And they would go into Everett, and they would go to the Evergreen Cemetery, and people had put little flags out like they do now for all the veterans. Mostly they were Civil War veterans at that time, and the veterans that had no flowers, they would put their flowers on those graves. Then they would go downtown for the parade. And the Spanish-American War veterans kind of made it their job to watch over the Civil War veterans that were there. The Civil War veterans marched in the parades for a long time. They marched in their uniforms if they still had them, or they could still fit into them. And if not, they wore their best clothes. And it was kind of pretty because the Confederate soldiers and the Union soldiers just marched shoulder to shoulder together in the parade. Then they all went to a potluck at the armory afterwards. So if this was in focus, that you can see the three little girls sitting in the cab. So they're waiting for the parade, and I don't know who the drummer is. He kind of looks like a Salvation Army drummer, but that's nowadays. This is a Spanish-American War veterans picnic. And the man in the front row that is holding the little boy, that's Fred Cushman. That's Fred Jr. So my grandfather's like 50 years old, and the lady sitting beside him that's turned around looking backwards, that's my grandma, and she's like 45 or something, 40 years old maybe. And in the back row in the book I'll tell you, but there's some of the kids are in the back row, who they are. Now, the best story on those picnics were that they had a bunch of races for the kids, and being that the four oldest Cushman girls were the laborers on the farm, they always did really well, and they weren't ever sure whether they were like Olympic-style runners or they just worked hard, you know, and most girls didn't do that. And the kids were barefooted all summer. They didn't wear shoes until the day school started again. And so, but they had this big baseball game. And there's a book around somewhere about all the baseball at Everett, and this is not in that book. The veterans played the young ladies that weren't married yet. So the first thing the young ladies had to do would be decide whether they were going to play in their high-top button shoes that had a kind of a high heel, or whether they're going to play barefoot. The Cushman girls played barefoot because it was summer and they always were barefoot. And Ina is going to really get me in heaven for this, but I am going to tell you about it anyway. So Ina played left field because she could really throw the ball. And Una played first base because she could really catch balls. And at this one-room school, there wasn't enough older kids to really play baseball unless you included the girls. Now in Everett, when you had recess, the boys went off to do something and the girls went off to do something, but in Highland School at recess, you had to invite the girls to play baseball if you wanted to play baseball, and you wanted to have really the right number of players. So the boys were very patient and very polite, and the girls learned to really play baseball, okay? So the day was a hot summer day, probably 80 degrees, like it's going to be on the 4th of July for us. And Ina had to wear what's called a camisole. It's the top half of a sheet underneath her blouse. But she decided not to wear it that day because it was so hot, so she left it home. And Ina went back to catch this ball, and she was running backwards with her hands up in the air. And you could see an inch of pink skin right around her waist. And the umpire had to call timeout because the audience weren't paying attention to the game anymore. They were all gossiping and yelling and talking and waving their hands. And the veterans needed time to go over, and, you know, it was a shocking experience. They saw a whole inch. I'm sorry, Aunt Ina. Okay, so the girls often won their running races. There was a boy at the Highland School called Eddie Novak. And he went on to high school at Everett High School, and he was a star on their baseball team. And when he left, he took all the baseball equipment with him because he owned it. So there was no baseball equipment. So Ina won her sprint race. And from all the presents that she could pick, she picked the baseball and the bat. And Ina then became the equipment manager at Highland School. And she took that bat and ball home every day after school and carried it back to school every day because it was that precious to her. So like, it's a different world you're gonna be reading about. Okay. This is a picture of my grandfather and grandmother with Fred when he was a baby. And if the museum doesn't have it, I have about 3 copies of it. And I'm going to ask at the family reunion if I can give the scrapbooks to the museum. This is a convention. It's in Washington, D.C. And actually, my grandfather is a tall one. Would you believe that? His wife is wearing a sash around her that says Washington on it. And the 2 ladies beside her are wearing ones that say Alaska. Washington and Alaska always went together, so the girls or whoever it was that come down from Alaska, they're probably 2 widows of Spanish-American War veterans. My grandfather actually lived to the age of 93. You know, it's just not something most people did. And he looks pretty good right there. I do not know how old he was at that time. This is my mother and her twins' graduation pictures from high school. I knew that if you take off the glasses on my mom, that by today's standards, she'd be a pretty nice, good-looking girl. But by the standards of the day, Ina was a much better-looking girl because Ina was plumper, and beautiful women were plumper than they are nowadays. So my mom would be right in style nowadays, but she was considered too thin. Okay. I was looking at this, I think Ina got called the last minute. They're wearing the same dress, but my mother has pressed her lace, you know, and stuff, and she's put makeup on, and Ina hasn't. And I was surprised what I knew of Ina, so I think she was surprised that they were going to have their pictures taken that day. They always wore exactly the same thing to high school. This is a school bus that they rode in. The lady that donated this to the museum is a lady that I played with as an old-time fiddler. And I was just so thrilled to hear that it was from her. So they walked 1.5 miles, and then there was a shelter that they could get in out of the rain, and they waited, and the school bus came, and it took them the last 1.5 miles. It would have been a 3-mile walk to high school otherwise. My mother caught pneumonia her sophomore year, and so her journey through high school was quite different from Ina's, and you'll read all about that. The chicken coops, have you heard about the chicken coops? They were in high school, they started in 1922, I think. The first year the chicken coops were open. Now they don't look like chicken coops to me, I don't think they really were. I think that's just the name they got. They look like portables, like we have nowadays for schools that have too many kids and they put portables out. And this is when they're first there, because they've still got the stumps and stuff. And eventually they put a roof between the 2. But this is before that. This is an early one. So I live in Arlington, and I know that the old Arlington High School was a WPA Works project. And that high school and this high school, there's so much the same. And like Arlington had murals painted on the walls, but this one did too. And I even wonder if they had the same architect draw them. But I like this particular picture because Cindy says this before they put an addition on in 1936. But over here is the gym. Now there's a great story about the gym. They tried to get a bond to pass to build it, and it passed. But the auditor threw it out, so there wasn't enough people paying taxes in the area that they could afford to pay $20,000 to build a gym. So the kids started selling magazine subscriptions, and I got the magazine, but it's about 2 away. And it was built all with volunteer material, volunteer labor. The kids several years of raising money. But back in between the WPA building, which they called the annex at that time, but it was called the main building after a short time, and the gym, you can see the 2 chicken coops still sitting there. They were still using them as classrooms. They're in the middle. And this is the Pink Palace in all its glory. I actually substitute taught one day there. And here is the magazine they sold, the Country Gentleman magazine. I don't know how much subscriptions were, but they divided the 4 classes up into 2 teams. And I thought Alta meant she sold 169 subscriptions in 1 year, but I think her team sold that many in 1 year. But they were doing that. It's in the annual of my mother's annual, and Ina's annual. And then they were doing that after my mother and Ina graduated, because Alta came back about 5 years later. And this is a very, very faded picture. I thought it was the girls from the home living class, you know, the cooking that they had to wear this. It's not. This is their cannery outfits. And so what do? You're a twin. Your family doesn't have a lot enough money, but they're not going to send twins to board off somewhere to go to college. They went to work on the cannery in Everett. And one of the shocking things I found when I did the math was their dad was making 33 cents an hour. They were making 27.5 cents an hour. When nowadays would a lady working at a cannery be earning anywhere that close to the amount of money that a father would be? The girls, the first thing they did was they bought carpets for the downstairs of the house, which made the house warmer in winter, and after that they gave their money to their dad, with the exception that they had to go to work about an hour and a half before he went to work, and then they worked a couple of hours later, because they were working 12-hour days and he was working an 8-hour day. And he was sitting around 4 hours a day that he could have been farming, waiting for them. So what he had done, and I didn't mention it, he had bought himself his own little pickup truck, because he saved about 2 hours a day using the truck to get the town to work over having the wagon and the horses pulling. And if it was flooded, what do you do with the horses? You know, nobody's going to steal your truck. Nobody's going to touch your mail laying, if the boxes are laying on the post below because they can't get them in the mailbox. Nobody's going to touch your mail. But a team of good-looking horses standing, hitched all day long, no. That would be just too much. They couldn't stand that, probably. On the other hand, his truck, he had a key. He turned it off with the key, put it in his wallet, left the truck sit there. Nobody knew how to drive a truck. Nobody drove anything like that. He'd come back, he had to turn the ignition on and get around to the front and crank the truck to get the truck going. It was safer than the horses were. So he bought a brand new, because there was no market for used cars yet. There were no cars old enough to be used cars. He bought a brand new Chevrolet touring car for the twins, and they had to make payments to him with their money they earned. Plus, they just gave him all the rest of the money because they were still trying to work on that mortgage to get that mortgage paid off. Okay, 1 year, and this is some of the best stories in the book, they decided to go to Wenatchee and pack apples in a warehouse. And Snoqualmie Pass was built in like 1905 for horses and oxen pulling wagons. And it was improved in 1928. They drove it in 1929, and only Ina could drive. Ina drove it. And it was a one-lane road that was graveled about halfway to the summit, and then it was dirt. There were pullouts every once in a while, so if 2 vehicles or horse and wagons met, the one coming downhill was supposed to back up to the last pullout to let the one coming up the hill have the right-of-way. And Chevrolets at that time were stronger in reverse than they were in first gear. And at the top, I had to put the thing in reverse to get up the top of the hill. So coming back, my mother was real sketchy. Angela went with them, another girl. They promised Ina they'd get out and walk, the last 2 miles up the hill so she wouldn't have to drive backwards. But they didn't have to. The car made it, and either Ina was a better driver or it wasn't quite as steep, which I don't think is quite as steep. So then they got to Blewett Pass, because you got to go over Blewett Pass. You're on the wrong, if you go over Snoqualmie Pass, you're still out in Wenatchee. You're going to be in Ellensburg. So there was a special road that was built called the Sunset Highway, and it went from Renton to Spokane. And it went over Snoqualmie Pass. You just heard about Snoqualmie Pass. Well, Blewett Pass was supposed to have been paved about 3 years before they drove it. And nobody let them know that when you pave a road over the mountain pass, you've got to come back the next year and look at it after the snow melts, because there's potholes and they weren't fixed. And there was gravel and landslides on the road. And the computer says it's something like 239 curves, a lot of them totally hairpin turns. And that was more exhausting to drive than Snoqualmie Pass was, actually. And they made more money, but it wasn't even ever crossed their minds to go back a second time. So you'll read about their adventures on the highway. So they went into Wenatchee, and they found a store that was actually selling overalls made for women. I mean, they were just astounded. No Cushman girl had ever worn anything except a dress. So here they are, and they're pretending like they're models. And the picture on the left is Ina with the curly blonde hair. And my mother's just had her first permanent wave in her whole life, and with the magnifying glass. She's kind of cute. But she's the one standing in the other, and they're just showing off. There's a whole bunch of pictures like this where they're modeling their new pants. And they did say that they were easier to pack apples in than dresses. And I don't know what their mother thought when they got home. The bank robbery. I had to tell about the bank robbery. The bank was robbed in Lake Stevens. And I don't know how the police were right on ready to go really fast, but my mother says that every time she thinks about it, it's like Keystone Cops, So they had worked with the county to get a road put into the farm, because at first there wasn't a road. But the county had just built a road, and there was a road, and it dead-ended right in their front yard. And they evidently hadn't thought about putting up dead-end signs, So the bank robbers came as fast as they could, 2 of them in the car, threw the mud on the road and ended up stuck in the mud right in the middle of their front yard where the road ended. And they jumped out of the car, and they left the car running, and the wheels kicking up dirt and mud, and they ran up the hill into the pig pen. Well, my mom wasn't there. She doesn't know where she was, but she wasn't there. Ruth was about age 12, and she was sitting on one of the horses in the front yard. Alta was age 8, and she was standing on the front porch. And pretty soon the cops came, 3 of them. And I don't know if there wasn't a siren or anything, and one of them yelled at Ruth and bawled her out for not holding those bandits there until they got there. And they hunted and hunted through that pig pen, and they could not find anybody. So the next time my grandfather went to cut wood, his crosscut saw was missing. And it ended up in a pawn shop in Snohomish. Eventually he went to Snohomish and bought his saw back. But he figured that the bank robbers had tried to pass themselves off as loggers. Well, they got as far as Granite Falls, and somehow Granite Falls knew ahead of time, and they were caught in Granite Falls, so they didn't get very far. And that was one of the stories that my mom said, what? And these 2 ladies, Ruth and Alta, were both telling the story. And, we heard this for the first time. These are the boys. Now, I figured out mathematically, the oldest one is Bill, and he's holding Fred. I guess you see it better than I see it. And I figure Fred's about 18 months. And then Roland is standing beside him. And this is my mother's wedding picture. She was married during the Depression you'll learn all about a Depression wedding and how it was different from a wedding we have nowadays. My father came, the Depression hit the east coast of the United States a couple of years before it hit out west. And towns like Tacoma were advertising in the newspapers in the east that they needed laborers. And his parents, and he came along with them, came from Wisconsin because of the ad from Tacoma. But they went through Everett on the way there, and they liked Everett, and they went to Tacoma and they came back. But there are a lot of people that came from those ads. And this was my dad's hobby. And this is my mother. She's about 35 in this picture. And she's the lady with the chickens. This is their backyard in Everett. He was a world-renowned Polish bantam breeder. And the chicken in the top is a rooster named Tim, who was the world champion crower. Now, that was determined because they had a contest at the fairs, and they counted how many times the rooster would crow in 10 minutes. And as far as all recorded history, Tim outcrowed them all, and he had the title. My father and Tim had a lot of publicity on this. So they didn't have children for 17 years. So it was like a gap between a grandmother. I actually remember my grandmother. I remember how badly I missed my grandmother when she passed away, and I would write her letters, and I would give them to the postman, and I would say, will you please give this to my mother in heaven? And of course I wrote by squiggly lines, and they said, well, she wouldn't read this. Oh, yes, she will. In heaven she could read it. It'd be okay. So he'd bring me the letter back about a month later and say, this came to me from your grandmother in heaven. It was the same letter, and I'd read it, I'd pretend what it said, you know. I really missed her. I do not have any memories of her. But that was because of the gap. So, okay, I'm going to go back. This is Alta. She is one of the authors. And this is her husband, Alex. He was a seaman at sea. He was the radio operator on boats. And after he married her, he became a landscaper. They raised 4 children, and they raised their nephew because one of the children, Betty, came down with multiple sclerosis, and they raised her son. It's Alta's graduation from high school picture. And Ruth came faithfully. This is Ruth Newman and her husband. This is their 50th wedding anniversary picture. And I have pictures of my mother and Ina, but I don't have any pictures of Ruth, so I put this one in because it's a good picture, and you know, I needed to have Ruth in there. That's her husband, Herb. I'm doing good here. This picture is interesting. It's in the book. It says it is Ina's husband and Fred and Roland, but I think it's Bill and Fred and Roland, but I didn't label it that way. Sometimes they would be labeled different than my mother said they were. He's a blonde. There were 6 blondes and 3 brunettes in the family. This is Roland's wedding picture. It was one of the better pictures I could find of him. He's marrying a lady that he meant mountain climbing. That was his hobby. He worked as an electrician at the Naval Shipyard in Bremerton after he got done being a sailor in World War II and the Korean conflict. And the lady that is obviously his bride is Mary. The next lady down is her sister Lucille. And the man is Ina's husband, Earl. After Mary passed, there was a lot of years that Roland and Lucille went places together and did things together, and I never got the connection until I did the book. Did you know the connection? Yeah. I always wondered who Lucille was. I didn't know until I saw this wedding picture. I have some cousins sitting here. A lot of these things, you know, I never heard of till I started working on the book. So, okay, this is Fred. You know Fred as the old man with the roses, probably. But this is his actual high school graduation picture, and it shows up better there than he's blonde. This was really bad. The picture itself is better. This is my mother. She is about 40 years old. She's at the public market in Seattle, and somebody jumped out and took the picture. This little girl beside her is me. And the book, on the end of the book, if it's here, I put this about my grandfather's 90th birthday party, because if you read that, that is an outline of all the important things in my book is right there. So it was perfect to put on the back cover instead of saying this book is about. And that's it. There's more stories. They're as good as the baseball bat and the girl who forgot to wear her camisole. You need to read the book. Thank you.